Hey folks, I'm coming to you live. You will be able to see me on TikTok, but you will not be able to see me on YouTube because my laptop camera is still acting up. I could try it once more, but if it doesn't work, I'm just going to take off with the black screen. I guess it's just my faulty camera. So if you want to see me and you can't because you're on YouTube, again, Victus, blame HP. Don't blame me because it's not my bag. Okay, I'll be diving right into Cider House Rules, Chapter 7, Part 2 today. So thank you all for joining me for another edition of Cider House Rules. I'll be picking up from page 300. Okay, and again, this is also going to be on YouTube. However, there is no video because my laptop camera is busto, as Dana will put it. Okay. No, he yelled at once. There's no need to shout, said Homer Wells, removing his hand from the forbidden place. Well, that's the second time you did that particular thing, Deborah pointed out, a mathematical certainty, and other certainties apparent in her voice. In Maine in 1940, Homer Wells was forced to accept that what they called necking was permitted. They called making out was within the rules. That what he had done with Melanie, what Grace Lynch appeared to be offering him, and what Candy and Wally had done at least once. To all of that, the answer was no. But how did Candy ever get pregnant? Homer Wells wondered, with Deborah Pettigrew's damp little face pressed to his chest. Her hair tickled his nose, but he could just manage to see over her. He could witness the Indian massacre. With her Fowler dispensing prophylactics even faster than Dr. Larch passed them out to the women at St. Cloud's, how could Wally have let her get pregnant? Wally was so provided for. Homer Wells couldn't understand why Wally was even interested in war. But would an orphan ever worried he was spoiled or untested? Is an orphan ever bored or restless? Or those just luxurious states of mind? He remembered that early day had been bored. I wouldn't call it luxurious. Homer. And there was a draft, as you might recall, in World War II, so it might not have been a matter of his choice, but Wally, as we might recall, was not opposed to the war. Are you asleep, Homer? Deborah Pettigrew asked him. No, he said. I was just thinking. Thinking what? Deborah asked. How come Wally and Candy do it, and we don't? Homer asked her. Deborah Pettigrew appeared to be wary of the question, or at least she was surprised by its bluntness. She was cautious in composing an answer. Well, she began philosophically, they're in love. Wally and Candy, aren't they? Right, said Homer Wells. Well, you never said you were in love with me, Deborah added. And I never said I was with you. That's right, Homer said. So it's against the rules to do it if you aren't in love? Look at it this way, said Deborah Pettigrew. She bit her lower lip. It was absolutely as hard as she'd ever thought. If you're in love and there's an accident, if somebody gets pregnant, is what I mean. Then if you're in love, you get married. Wally and Candy are in love, and if they have an accident, they'll get married. Maybe, thought Homer Wells. Maybe the next time. But what he said was, I see. What he thought was, so those are the rules. It's about accidents. It's about getting pregnant and not wanting to have a baby. My God, is everything about that? He considered taking the rubber out of his pocket and presenting it to Deborah Pettigrew. If the argument was that an accidental pregnancy was really the only reason for not doing it, what did she think of the alternative that Herb Fowler so repeatedly presented? But by arguing in this fashion, wouldn't he be suggesting that all intimacy could be crudely accounted for, Or was crude itself? Or is intimacy crude only for him? In the movie, several human scalps were dangling from a spear, for reasons unfathomable to Homer Wells. The Indians carried on and on about the spear, as if such a spear were a treasure. Suddenly, a cavalry officer had his hand pinned to a tree by an arrow. The man went to great lengths, using his teeth in his other hand, to free the arrow from the tree, but the arrow still stuck very prominently through his hand. An Indian with a tomahawk approached the cavalry officer. It looked like the end of him, especially since he insisted on trying to cock his pistol with the thumb of the hand that had the arrow struck through it. Why doesn't he use his good hand? Wells wondered. The thumb worked. The pistol, finally, was cocked. Homer Wells concluded from the demonstration that the arrow had managed to pass through the hand without damaging the branch of the median nerve that goes to the muscles of the thumb. Lucky man, thought Homer Wells, as the cavalry officer shot the approaching Indian in the heart. It must be the heart, thought Homer Wells, because the Indian died instantly. It was funny how he could see the pictures of the hand in Gray's Anatomy more clearly than he could see the movie. He took Deborah home, begging her forgiveness for not offering to walk her to her door. One of the dogs was loose. It had broken its chain, and clawed furiously at the driver's side window, which Homer had rolled up just in time. It breathed and slobbered and clicked its teeth against the glass. It became so fogged and smeared that Homer had difficulty seeing when he turned the Cadillac around. "Cut it out, Eddie!" Deborah Pettigrew was screaming at the dog as Homer drove away. "Would you just cut it out, Eddie? Please!" The dog chased the Cadillac for nearly a mile. "Eddie?" thought Homer Wells. Didn't Nurse Angela name someone Eddie once? He thought so, but it must have been someone who was adopted quickly, the way it was supposed to be done. By the time he got to Kendall's Lobster Pound, Ray was home. He was making tea and warmed his deeply lined, cracked hands on the pot. Under his ragged nails was the mechanic's permanent oil-black grime. "Well, look who survived the drive-in," Ray said. "You better sit a while and have some tea with me." Homer could see that Candy and Wally were out on the dock, huddled together. "Lovebirds don't feel cold, I guess," Ray said to Homer. "They don't look like they're finished saying goodbye." Homer was happy to have the tea and to sit with Ray. He liked Ray, and he knew Ray liked him. "What did you learn today?" Ray asked him. Homer was going to say something about the drive-in rules, but he guessed that wasn't what Ray meant. "Nothing," said Homer Wells. "No, I'll bet you learned something," Ray said. "You're a learner." "I know, because I was one. Once you see how something's done, you know how to do it yourself. That's all I mean." Ray had taught Homer oil changes and lubrications, plugs and points and engine timing, fuel line maintenance and front-end alignment. He'd shown the boy how to tighten a clutch, and to Ray's astonishment, Homer had remembered. He'd also shown him a valve job and how to replace the universal. One summer, Homer Wells had learned about the mechanics, more about them than Wally knew. But it wasn't just Homer's manual dexterity that Ray was fond of. Ray respected loneliness, and an orphan, he imagined, had a fair share of that. "Shoot," said Ray. "I'll bet there's nothing you couldn't learn. Nothing your hands wouldn't remember. If your hands ever got hold of it, whatever it was." "Right," said Homer Wells, smiling. He remembered the perfect balance in the set of dilators with the Douglas points. How you could hold one steadily between your thumb and index finger just by resting the shaft against the pad of your middle finger. It will move only in exactly when and where you moved it. And how wonderfully precise it was, Homer thought. And the vaginal speculum comes in more than one size, that there was always a size that was just right. And how sensitive an adjustment could be accomplished by just a half turn of the little thumb screw. How the duck-billed speculum could hold the lips of the vagina open exactly wide enough. Homer Wells, 21, breathing in the steam of the hot sea, sat waiting for his life to begin. In the Cadillac with Wally, driving back to Ocean View, the rock and water prettiness of Hart's Haven, giving way to the scruffier, more tangled land of Hart's Rock. Homer said, "I was wondering." "Don't tell me if you'd rather not talk about it." "I was just wondering how it happened that Candy got pregnant." "I mean, weren't you using anything?" "Sure I was," Wally said. "I was using one of her fellow's rubbers, but it had a hole in it." "It had a hole in it?" said Wells. "Not a big one," Wally said, "but I could tell it had a hole. You know, it leaked." Any hole is big enough, Homer said. Sure is, Wally said. The way he carries the things around with him, it probably got poked by something in his pocket. I guess you don't use the rubbers Herb throws at you anymore, said Homer Wells. That's right, Wally said. And Wally was asleep as peacefully as a prince, as out to the world as a king. Homer Wells slipped out of bed, found his pants, found the rubbers in the pocket, and took one to the bathroom where he filled it up with water from the cold water tap. The hole was tiny but precise. A fine but uninterrupted needle of wire streamed out of the end of the rubber. The hole was bigger than a pinprick, but not nearly so large as a nail would make. Maybe Herb Fowler used a thumbtack or the point of a compass, thought Homer Wells. It was a deliberate sort of hole, perfectly placed dead center. The thought of Herb Fowler making holes made Homer Wells shiver. He remembered the first fetus he'd seen on his way back from the incinerator, but appeared to have fallen from the sky. He recalled the extended arms of the murdered fetus from the 3 Mile Falls. The bruise that was green going to yellow on Grace Lynch's breast. At Grace's journey, St. Cloud's originated from one of Herb Fowler's prophylactics. At St. Cloud's, he had seen anguish in the plainer forms of unhappiness, and depression, and destructiveness. He was familiar with mean-spiritedness and with injustice, too. But this is evil, isn't it? Wondered Homer Wells. Have I seen evil before? He thought of the woman with the pony in her mouth. What do you do when you recognize evil? He wondered. He looked out Wally's window. In the darkness, in his mind's eye, he saw the eroded, still unplanted hillside behind the hospital and the boys' division at St. Cloud's. He saw the thick but damaged, sound-absorbing forest beyond the river that carried away his grief for Fuzzy Stone. If he had known Mrs. Grogan's prayer, he would have tried it. The prayer that Homer used to calm himself was the end of chapter 43 of David Copperfield. There being 20 more chapters to go, these words were perhaps too uncertain for a prayer. Homer spoke them to himself uncertainly, not as if he believed the words to be true, but as if he were trying to force them to be true. By repeating and repeating the words, he might make the words true for him, for Homer Wells. I've stood aside to see the phantoms of those days go by me. They're gone, and I resume the journey of my story. But all that night you lay awake because the phantoms of those days were not gone. Like the tiny, terrible holes in the prophylactics, the phantoms of those days were not easy to detect. Their meaning was unknown. They were there. In the morning, Wally left half-heartedly for the university in Orano. The next day, Candy left for Camden Academy. The day before the picking crew arrived at Ocean View, Homer Wells, the tallest and oldest boy at Cape Kenneth High School, attended the first-class meeting of senior biology. His friend Deborah Pettigrew, the lead to the laboratory. Homer got lost en route and wandered into a class called Woodshop. The textbook for senior biology was B.A. Bensley's Practical Anatomy of the Rabbit. Text and illustrations were intimidating to the other students, but the book filled Homer Wells with longing. It was a shock for him to realize how much he missed Dr. Larch's well-worn copy of Gray's. Homer, at first glance, was critical of Bensley. Whereas Gray's began with the skeleton, Bensley began with the tissues. But the teacher of the class was no fool. The cadaverous man was Mr. Hood, but he pleased Homer by announcing that he did not intend to follow the text exactly. The class, like Gray's, would begin with the bones. Comforted by what for him was routine, Homer relished his first look at the ancient yellow skeleton of a rabbit. The class was hushed. Some students were repulsed. Wait till they get to the urogenital system, thought Homer Wells, his eyes skimming over the perfect bones. But this thought shocked him too. He realized he was looking forward to getting to the poor rabbit's urogenital system. He had a lateral view of the rabbit's skull. He tested himself with the naming of parts. It was so easy for him. Cranial, orbital, nasal, frontal, mandible, maxilla, premaxilla. How well he remembered Clara and the others who had taught him so much. As for Clara, she was finally put to rest in a place she might not have chosen for herself. The cemetery in St. Cloud's was the abandoned part of town. Perhaps this was appropriate, thought Dr. Larch, who supervised Clara's burial, because Clara herself had been abandoned, and surely she had been more explored and examined than she had ever been loved. Nurse Eden was shocked to see the departing coffin, but Nurse Angela assured her that none of the orphans had passed away in the night. Mrs. Grogan accompanied Dr. Larch to the cemetery. Larch had asked her to come with him, because he knew that Mrs. Grogan enjoyed every opportunity to say her prayer. There was no minister or priest or rabbi in St. Cloud's. If holy words were in order, someone from 3 Mile Falls came and said them. It was a testimony to Wilbur Larch's increasing isolationism that he refused to send to 3 Mile Falls for anything, that he preferred Mrs. Grogan if he was forced to listen to holy words at all. It was the first burial. It was the first burial that Wilbur Larch had wept over. Mr. Grogan knew that his tears were not for Clara. Larch would have buried Clara if he thought that Homer Wells would ever be coming back. Well, he's wrong, Nurse Angela said. Even a saint can make a mistake. Homer Wells will be back. He belongs here, like it or not. Is it the ether? Dr. Larch wondered. He meant, was it the ether that gave him the sense, increasingly, that he knew everything that was going to happen? For example, he had anticipated the letter that arrived for F. Stone, forwarded from Fuzzy's P.O. box address. Is this some sick joke? Nurse Angela asked, turning the envelope around and around. I'll take that, please, Dr. Larch said. It was from the Board of Trustees, as he had expected. That was why they'd wanted those follow-up reports from him, why they requested the addresses of the orphans. They were checking up on him, Larch knew. The letter to Fuzzy began with cordial good wishes. It said that the board knew a great deal about Fuzzy from Dr. Larch, but they wished to know anything further about Fuzzy's St. Cloud experience, anything naturally that he wanted to share with them. The St. Cloud's experience sounded to Wilbur Larch like a mystical happening. The attached questionnaire made him furious, although he did amuse himself by trying to imagine which of the questions had been conceived by the tedious Dr. Gingrich, and which of them had flowed from the chilling mind of Mrs. Goodall. Dr. Larch also had fun imagining how others would answer the silly questionnaire, but he took the immediate business very seriously. He wanted Fuzzy Stone's answers to the questionnaire to be perfect. He wanted to be sure that the Board of Trustees would never forget Fuzzy Stone. There were 5 questions. Every single one of them was based upon the incorrect assumption that every child must have been at least 5 or 6 years old before he or she was adopted. This and other stupidities convinced Wilbur Larch that Dr. Gingrich and Mrs. Goodall were going to be easy adversaries. 1. Was your life at St. Cloud's properly supervised? Please include in your answer if you ever felt that your treatment was especially affectionate or especially instructive. We would certainly want to hear if you felt your treatment was ever abusive. Did you receive adequate medical attention at St. Cloud's? Were you adequately prepared for your new life in a foster home? Do you feel your foster home was carefully and correctly chosen? Would you suggest any possible improvements in the methods and management of St. Cloud's? Specifically, would you feel things might have gone more smoothly for you if there had been a more youthful, energetic staff in residence, or perhaps simply a larger staff? Was any attempt made to integrate the daily life of the orphanage with the life of the surrounding community? What community? Screamed Wilbur Larch. He stood at the window in Nurse Angela's office and stared at the bleak hillside where Wally had wanted to plant apple trees. Why hadn't they come back and planted the stupid trees, even if all that business was just to please me? Larch wondered. What community? He howled. Oh yes, he thought. I could have asked the station master to offer them religious instruction, to speak to them about the terrifying chaos of homeless souls hovering in every niche of the sky. I could have asked that worthy gentleman to display his underwear catalogs too. I could have asked the family of child beaters from 3 Mile Falls to come once a week and give lessons. I could have detained a few of the women who were having abortions and asked them to reveal to all of us why they didn't want to have children at that particular moment in their lives. Or I could have invited a few of the mothers back. They could have explained to the children why they were left there. That would have been instructive. Oh God, thought Wilbur Larch, what a community we could have been if only I'd been more youthful, more energetic. Oh yes, I made some mistakes, he thought. And for a black hour or two, he remembered some of them. If only I knew how to build a breathing machine, he thought. If only I could have come up with a different set of lungs for Fuzzy. Maybe Homer Wells will tell them that he was not adequately prepared for his first view of the fetus on the hill. And had there been a way to prepare Homer for 3 Mile Falls, for the Drapers of Waterville, or for the Winkles being swept away? What was my choice? Or Wilbur Larch? I suppose that I could have not apprenticed him. We are put on this earth to be of use, Wilbur Larch, as Fuzzy Stone, wrote to the Board of Trustees. It's better to do than to criticize, wrote that young idealist Fuzzy Stone. It's better to do anything than to stand idly by. You tell them, Fuzzy, thought Dr. Larch. And so Fuzzy Stone told the Board of Trustees that the hospital at St. Cloud's was a model of the form. It was Larch who made me want to be a doctor, as he wrote. That old guy Larch, he's an inspiration. Talk about energy, the guy's full of pep as a teenager. Better be careful about sending any young people to St. Cloud's. Larch will work them so hard, they'll get sick. You'll get so tired out, they'll retire in a month. You think those old nurses don't do a day's work? Let me tell you, when Nurse Angela's pitching for stickball, you'd think you were competing in an Olympic event. Talk about affectionate. It's them, all right. They're always hugging and kissing you, but they know how to shake some sense into you, too. You talk about supervised, Rosie Stone wrote. Did you ever find out that you were being watched by owls? That's Nurse Edna and Nurse Angela. They're owls. They don't miss a thing. Some of the girls used to say that Mrs. Grogan knew what they did before they did it, before they even knew they were going to do it. Talk about community, Fuzzy Stone. St. Cloud's was something special. I remember people getting off the train and walking up the hill just to look the place over. It must have been because we were such a model community for that area. I just remember these people coming and going, coming and going. They were just there to look us over, as if we were one of the marvels of Maine. One of the marvels of Maine? Thought Wilbur Larch, struggling to get control of himself. A stray puff of wind blew the open window open in Nurse Angela's office, carrying some of the black smoke from the incinerator with it. The smoke brought Larch nearer to his senses. I'd better stop, he thought. I don't want to get carried away. He rested in the dispensary after his historical effort. Nurse Edna looked in on him once. Wilbur Larch was one of the marvels of Maine to her. She was worried about him. Larch was a little worried about himself when he woke. Where had the time gone? Problem is that I'll have to last, he thought. He could rewrite history, but he couldn't touch time. Dates were fixed. Time marched at his own pace. Even if he could convince Homer Wells to go to a real medical school, it would take time. It would take a few years for Fuzzy Stone to complete his training. I have to last until Fuzzy's qualified to replace me, thought Wilbur Larch. He felt like hearing Mrs. Grogan's prayer again, so he went to the girls' division a little early for his usual delivery of Jane Eyre. He eavesdropped in the hall on Mrs. Grogan's prayer. I must ask her if she'd mind saying it to the boys, he thought, then wondered if it would confuse the boys, coming so quickly on the heels of, or just before, the Princes of Maine. Kings of New England benediction. I get confused myself sometimes, Dr. Larch knew. Grant us a safe lodging and a holy rest, Miss Grogan was saying, and peace at the last. Amen, Wilbur Larch, the saint of St. Cloud's, who was 70-something, and an ether addict, who felt that he'd come a long way, and still had a long way to go. When Homer Wells read the questionnaire sent him by the St. Cloud's Board of Trustees, he didn't know exactly what made him anxious. Of course, Dr. Larch and the others were getting older, but they were always older to him. It did occur to him to wonder what might happen to St. Cloud's when Dr. Larch was too old. This thought was so troubling that he tucked the questionnaire and the returned envelope to the board into his copy of Practical Anatomy of the Rabbit. Besides, it was the day the migrants arrived. It was the harvest time in Ocean View, and Homer Wells was busy. He and Mrs. Worthington met the picking crew at the Apple Mart, led them to their quarters in the cider house. More than half the crew had picked at Ocean View before and knew the way. The crew boss was what Mrs. Worthington called an old hand. He looked very young to Homer. It was the first year that Mrs. Worthington dealt directly with the picking crew and their boss. Having a relationship by mail had been one of Senior Worthington's responsibilities. Senior had always maintained that if you kept a good crew boss, year after year all the hiring and the necessary taking charge of the crew during the harvest would be conducted by the boss. Hello. His name was Arthur Rose. He looked about Wally's age, just barely older than Homer. Although he must have been older. He'd been the crew boss for 5 or 6 years. One year, Senior Worthington had written to the old man, who'd seen his crew boss as long as Olive could remember, and Arthur Rose had written back to Senior saying he was going to be the crew boss now. The old boss, Arthur Rose had written, he was dead tired of traveling. As it turned out, the old boss was just dead, but Arthur Rose had done a good job. He brought the right number of pickers, and very few of them ever quit or ran off. They lost more than a day or two of good work because of too much drinking. They seemed to be a firm control over the degree of fighting among them, even when they were accompanied by a woman or two. and when there was an occasional child among them, the child behaved. There were always pickers who fell off ladders. There had been no serious injuries. There were always small accidents around the cider press, but that was fast, often late night work, and the men were tired or drinking a little. There was the predictable clumsiness or drinking that led to infrequent accidents involved in an almost ritualistic use of the cider house roof. Running a farm had given Olive Worthington a warm feeling for the daylight hours and a grave suspicion of the night. The most trouble that people got into, in Olive's opinion, was trouble that they encountered because they stayed up too late. Olive had written out the roses of Senior's death and told him that the picking crew responsibility of Ocean View had now fallen to her. He wrote him at the usual address, a P.O. box in a town called Greene, South Carolina. Arthur Rose responded promptly, both with his condolences and with his assurance that the crew would arrive, as always, on time and in correct numbers. He was true to his word, except when writing his first name on an envelope, when she annually noted it in his Christmas card. Happy holidays, Arthur. Olive Worthington never called him Arthur. No one else called him Arthur either. Reasons that were never explained to Homer Wells, but perhaps for a presence of authority that was necessary for a good crew boss to maintain, he was Mr. Rose to everybody. When Olive introduced him to Homer Wells, that measure of respect was made clear. Homer, Olive said, this is Mr. Rose. And this is Homer Wells, Olive added. Glad to know you, Homer, said Mr. Rose. Homer has become my good right hand, Olive said affectionately. Glad to hear that, Homer, said Mr. Rose. He shook Homer's hand strongly, although he let go of the hand with unusual quickness. He was no better dressed than the rest of the picking crew, and he was slender like most of them, but he managed a certain style with shabbiness. If his jacket was dirty and torn, it was a pinstripe suit jacket, double-breasted model that had, in its history, given someone a degree of sharpness. Mr. Rose wore a silk necktie for a belt. His shoes were also good. Good shoes were vital for farm work. They were old, but well-oiled, resoled, comfortable-looking, and in good condition. His socks matched. His suit jacket had a watch pocket, and it was a gold watch that worked. It was a gold watch. He regarded the watch naturally and often, as if time were very important to him. He was so clean-shaven he looked as if he might never have needed to shave. His face was a smooth brick of the darkest, unsweetened bitter chocolate. In his mouth he expertly moved around a small, bright white mint, which always surrounded him with a fresh and alert fragrance. He spoke and moved slowly, modestly, yet deliberately, in both speech and gesture. He gave the impression of being humble and contained. Yet when no one observed him standing still and not speaking, he looked extraordinarily fast and sure of himself. It was a hot Indian summer day. The Apple Mart was inland enough to miss what little sea breeze there was. Mr. Rose and Mrs. Worthington stood talking among the parked and moving farm vehicles in the Apple Mart lot. The rest of the picking crew waited in their cars, the windows rolled down, an orchestra of black fingers strumming the sides of the cars. There were 17 pickers and a cook, no women or children this year, to Olive's relief. Very nice, Mr. Rose said, about the flowers in the cider house. Mrs. Worthington touched the rules she'd tacked to the wall by the kitchen light switch as she was leaving. And you'll point out these to everyone, won't you please? Olive asked. Oh yes, I'm good at rules, said Mr. Rose, smiling. I'll come back and watch the first press, Homer. Mr. Rose said as Homer held open the van door for Olive. Sure you got better things to watch, movies and stuff. But if you ever got some time on your hands, you come watch us make a little cider. About 1,000 gallons, he added shyly. He scuffed his feet as if he were ashamed he might be bragging. All we need is 8 hours and about 300 bushels of apples, said Mr. Rose. 1,000 gallons, he repeated proudly. On the way back to the Apple Mart, Olive Worthington said to Homer, Mr. Rose is a real worker. The rest of them were like him. They can improve themselves. Homer didn't understand her tone. Certainly he had heard in her voice admiration, sympathy, even affection, but there was also in her voice the ice that encases a long ago and immovable point of view. Fortunately for Melanie, the picking crew at York Farm included 2 women and a child. Melanie felt safe to stay in the cider house. One of the women was a wife, and the other woman was the first woman's mother and the cook. The wife picked the crew, while the old lady looked after the food and the child, who was silent to the point of non-existence. There was only one shower, and it was outdoors, installed behind the cider house, on a cinder block platform under a former grape arbor whose trellises were rotted by the weather. Women showered first every evening. They permitted no peeking. The Oak Farm crew boss was a mild man. It was his wife who came along, and he raised no objections to Melanie sharing the cider house with this crew. His name was Rather. It was a nickname stemming from the man's laconic habit of remarking during each activity that he'd rather be doing something else. His authority seemed less certain, or at least less electrical, than the authority commanded by Mr. Rose. No one called him Mr. Rather. He was a steady but not exceptionally fast picker, yet he always accounted for over 100 bushels a day. It took Melanie just one day to observe that his fellow workers paid Rather a commission. They gave him 1 bushel for every 20 bushels they picked. After all, Rather explained to Melanie, I get them the job. He was fond of saying that his commission, under the circumstances, was rather small. Rather never suggested that Melanie owed him anything. After all, I didn't get you your job, he said cheerfully. By her 3rd day in the field, she was managing 80 bushels. She also assisted as a bottler with the first cider press. Melanie was disappointed. She found the time to ask anyone had heard of both of you, and no one had. Perhaps because he viewed everything with slightly less cynicism than Melanie brought to each of her experiences, Homer Wells needed a few days to notice the commission Mr. Rose exacted from his crew. He was the fastest picker among them, without ever appearing to rush. He never dropped fruit. He never bruised the apples by bumping his canvas picking bucket against the ladder rungs. Mr. Rose could have managed 110 bushels a day on his own. But even with his speed, Homer realized that his regular 150 or 160 bushels a day were very high. He took as his commission only 1 bushel out of every 40. He had a crew of 15, and no one fewer than 80 bushels a day. Mr. Rose would pick a very fast half-dozen bushels. Then he'd just rest for a while, or he'd supervise the picking technique of his crew. A little shower, George, he'd say. You bruise that fruit, what's it going to be good for? Just cider, George would say. That's right, Mr. Rose would say. Cider apples is only a nickel a bushel. Okay, George would say. Sure, Mr. Rose would say. Everything's going to be okay. 3rd day it rained, no one picked. Both apples and pickers slipped in the rain, and the fruits were sensitive to bruising. Homer liked to watch Meanie Hyde and Mr. Rose conduct the first cider press, which they directed out of the range of the splatter. They put 2 men on the press, and 2 bottling. They shifted fresh men into the rotation almost every hour. Meanie watched only one thing, whether the rocks were stacked crookedly or whether they were right. When the press boards are stacked crookedly, you can lose the press. 3 bushels of apples in one mess, 8 or 10 gallons of cider, and the palm is flying everywhere. The men at the press wore rubber aprons. The ballers wore rubber boots. The whine of the grinder reminded Homer Wells of the sound he only imagined at St. Cloud's. The sawmill blades were ear-splitting in his dreams, in his insomnia. The pump sucked. Pump sucked the spout, disgorged a pulp of seeds. Make sure I have this right. Yeah. Spout disgorged a pulp of seeds and skinned and mashed apples, even worms, if there were worms. It looked like what Nurse Angela calmly called upchug. From the big tub under the press, the cider whirred through a rotary screen, which strained it into the 1,000-gallon vat, where, only recently, Grace Lynch had exposed herself to Homer. In 8 hours of no-nonsense, stayed 1,000 gallons. The conveyor tracks rattled the jugs along, straight into cold storage. A man named Branches was assigned to hose out the vat and rinse off the rotary screen. His name stemmed from his dexterity in the big trees, and his scorn for using a ladder. A man named Hero washed the press cloths. Meanie Hyde told Homer that the man had been a kind of hero once. That's all I heard. He's been coming here for years, but he was a hero. Just once, Meanie added. There might be more shame attached to the rarity of the man's heroism than there was glory to be sung for his moment in the sun. I'll bet you was bored, Miss Rose said to Homer, who lied, who said it had been interesting. 8 hours of hanging around a cider mill are several hours in excess of interesting. You gotta come at night to get the real feel of it, Miss Rose confided. This was just a rainy day press. Pick all day and press all night. Then you get the feel of it. He winked at Homer, assuming he managed to make some secret life instantly clear. Then he handed Homer a cup of cider. Homer had been sipping cider all day. The cup was offered solemnly. Some pledge about pressing cider at night was being made on the spot. And so Homer took the cup and drank. His eyes watered instantly. The cider was so strongly laced with rum that Homer felt his face flush and his stomach glow. Without further acknowledgement, Mr. Rose took back the cup and offered the remaining swallow to the man called Branches, who bolted it down without needing to make the slightest adjustment on the spray nozzle of his hose. When Homer Rose was loading some cider jugs in the van, he saw the cup make its way between Meanie Hyde and the man called Hero, all of it under the calm supervision of Mr. Rose, who had not revealed the source of the rum to anyone. The phrase, a gift for concealment, occurred to Homer Wells in regard to Mr. Rose. Homer had no idea where such a phrase had come from. Unless it was Charles Dickens or Charlotte Bronte, he doubted he'd encountered it in Gray's Anatomy, or Mensley's Practical Anatomy of the Rabbit. There were no movements wasted in what movement there was to be seen by Mr. Rose, a quality that Homer Wells had formerly associated only with Dr. Larch. Surely Dr. Larch had other quite different qualities, as did Mr. Rose. All right, quick intermission before I continue. Quick bio break. Be right back. Okay, I'm back. Oof. All right, here we go, folks. I'm telling you, these chapters are long. Who knew cider could be such a labor? But there it is. Okay. Back at the apple mart, harvest appeared at a momentary standstill, held up as the rain, which Big Dot tapped in the mart. Women watched sourly from their assembly line positions along the conveyor tracks in the packing line. No one seemed very excited by the cider Homer brought. It was very bland, as the first cider usually is, and too watery, composed, typically of early Macs and Gravensteins. You don't get a good cider until October, Meanie had told Homer. Mr. Rose had confirmed this with a solemn nod. A good cider needs some of those last picked apples, golden delicious and winter banana. The Baldwins are russets too. Cider's got no smoke before October, said Big Dot Taft, inhaling her cigarette listlessly. Homer was listening to Big Dot Taft, felt like her voice dulled. Wally was away, Candy was away, and the anatomy of a rabbit was, after Clara, no challenge. Migrants, whom he so eagerly anticipated, were just plain hard workers. Life was just a job. He grew up without noticing when. Was there nothing remarkable in the transition? They had 4 days of good picking weather at Ocean View before Meanie Hyde said there'd be a night press, and Mr. Rose again invited Homer to come to the cider house and get the feel of it. Homer had a quiet dinner with Mrs. Worthington, and only after he'd helped her wash the dishes did he say he thought he'd go to the cider house and see if he could help with the pressing. He knew they would have been hard at work for 2 or 3 hours. What a good worker you are, Homer, Olive told him appreciatively. Homer Wells shrugged. It was a cold, clear night, the very best weather for McIntosh apples. Warm, sunny days and cold nights. It was not so cold that Homer couldn't smell the apples as he walked to the cider house. It was not so dark that he needed to keep on the dirt road. he can go over land, because he was not on the road. He was able to approach the cider house unobserved. For a while, he stood outside the range of the lights blazing in the mill room, listening to the sounds of the men working, press, and talking, laughing. The murmur of the men who were talking and laughing on the cider house roof Homer Wells listened for a long time. But he realized that when the men were not making an effort to be understood by a white person, he couldn't understand them at all. Not even Mr. Rose, whose clear voice appeared to punctuate the other voices with calm but emphatic interjections. They're also pressing cider at York Farm that night. Melanie wasn't interested. She wasn't trying to understand either the process or the lingo. The crew boss, rather, had made it clear to her that the men resented her working the press, or even bottling. It cut into their extra pay. Melanie was tired from the picking anyway. She lay on her bed in the bunk room of the cider house reading Jane Eyre. There was a man asleep at the far end of the bunk room, but Melanie's reading light didn't disturb him. He had drunk too much beer, which was all that Rather allowed the men to drink. The beer was kept in the coal storage room, right next to the mill. The men were drinking and talking together while they ran the press. A friendly woman named Sandra, who was Rather's wife, was sitting on a bed not too far from Melanie, trying to mend a zipper on a pair of one of the men's trousers. The man's name was Sammy, and he had only one pair of trousers. We so often he'd wander in from the mill room to see how Sandra's work was progressing. An overlarge ballooning pair of undershorts hanging almost to his knobby knees, his legs below the knees like tough little vines. Sandra's mother, whom everyone called Ma, and who cooked plain but large meals for the crew, lay in a big lump on the bed next to Sandra, more than her share of blankets piled on top of her. She was always cold, but it was the only thing she complained about. Sammy came into the bunk room, sipping a beer, bringing with him the apple mash odor of the mill room. The bladder from the press dotted his bare leg. Legs like that, no wonder you want your pants back, Sandra said. What are my chances? Sammy asked. 1, your zipper is jammed. 2, you tore it off from your pants, Sandra said. Why are you in such a hurry with your zipper for? Ma asked, without moving from her lump. Shit, Sammy said. We went back to the press. Every once in a while, the grinder caught on something, a big stem or a congestion of seeds, and it made the noise like a circular saw gagging on a knot. When that happened, Ma would say, there goes somebody's hand. Or, there goes somebody's whole head, drank too much beer and fell in. Overall, Melanie managed to read. She wasn't being antisocial in her view. The 2 women were nice to her once they realized she was not after any of the men. The men were respectful of her work, of the mark upon her that was made by the missing boyfriend. Although they teased her, they meant no harm. She had lied successfully to one of the men. The lie, as she knew it would, had gotten around. The man was named Wednesday for no reason. That was never explained to Melanie. She wasn't interested enough to ask. Wednesday had asked her too many questions about the particular ocean view she was looking for and the boyfriend she was trying to find. She'd snagged her ladder in a loaded tree and was trying to ease it free without shaking any apples to the ground. Wednesday was helping her when Melanie said, pretty tight pants I'm wearing, wouldn't you say? Wednesday looked at her and said, yeah, I would. You can see everything in these pockets, right? Melanie asked. Wednesday looked again and saw only the odd sickle shape of the partially open horn-rimmed barrette, tight and hard against the worn denim. It dug into Melanie's thigh. It was the barrette that Mary Agnes Quirk had stolen from Candy. Melanie had stolen it for herself. One day, she imagined, her hair might be long enough for the barrette to be of use. Till such time, she carried it like a pocket knife in her right thigh pocket. What's that? Wednesday asked. That's a penis knife, Melanie said. What knife? Wednesday asked. You heard me, Melanie said. It's real small and it's real sharp. It's good for just one thing. What's that? Wednesday asked. Cuts off the end of a penis, Melanie said, real fast. Well, easy, just the end. Baking crew at York Farm had been a knife-carrying crew. Some might have asked Melanie to display the penis knife. Not exactly poetic, is it? But I don't know. Just an object of general appreciation among knife-carrying friends. No one asked. The story to appear to hold. It allied itself with the other stories attached to Melanie and solidified the underlying uneasy feeling among the workers at York Farm. That Melanie was no one to mess with. Around Melanie, even the beer drinkers behaved. The only ill effect of the York farm picking crew drinking beer while they pressed cider was the frequency of their urinating, which Melanie objected to only when they peed too near the cider house. Hey, I don't want to hear that, she'd holler out the window when she could hear anyone pissing. I don't want to smell it later either. Get away from the building. What's the matter? You afraid of the dark? Sandra and Ma liked Melanie for that. They enjoyed the refrain. Whenever they heard someone peeing, they would not fail to holler in unison, What's the matter? You're afraid of the dark? If everyone tolerated Melanie's hardness, or even appreciated her for it, no one liked her reading at night. She was the only one who read anything. It took a while for her to realize how unfriendly they thought reading was, how insulted they felt when she did it. They finished pressing that night and everyone settled into bed. Melanie asked as usual if her reading light was going to bother anyone. The light don't bother nobody, Wednesday said. There were murmurs of consent, and Rather said, You all remember Cameron? There was a laughter, and Rather explained to Melanie that Cameron, who'd worked at York Farm for years, had been such a baby that he needed a light on, all night, just to sleep. He thought animals was going to eat him if you shut out the light, Sammy said. What animals? Melanie asked. Cameron didn't know, someone said. Melanie kept reading Jane Eyre, and after a while Sandra said, It's not the light that bothers us, Melanie. Yeah, someone said. Melanie didn't get it for a while, but gradually she became aware that they all had rolled toward her in their beds and were watching her sullenly. Okay, she said, so what bothers you? What you reading about anyway? Wednesday asked. Yeah, Sammy said. What's so special about that book? It's just a book, Melanie said. Pretty big deal that you can read it, huh? Wednesday asked. What? Said Melanie. Maybe if you like it so much, Rather said, we might like it too. You want me to read to you? Melanie asked. Somebody read it to me once, Sandra said. It wasn't me, Ma said. It wasn't your father either. I never said it was, Sandra said. I never heard nobody read to nobody, Sammy said. Yeah, somebody said. Melanie saw that some of the men were propped on their elbows in their beds, waiting. Even Ma turned her great lump around and faced Melanie's bed. Quiet, everybody, Rather said. For the first time in her life, Melanie was afraid. After all her efforts in her hard traveling, she felt she had been returned to the girls' division without being aware of it. It was only that. It was the first time anyone had expected something of her. She knew what Jane Eyre meant to her, but what could it mean to them? She'd read it to the children too young to understand half the words, too young to pay attention until the end of a sentence. They were orphans, prisoners of the routine of being read to aloud. It was the routine that mattered. Melanie was more than halfway in her third or fourth journey through Jane Eyre. She said, I'm on page 208. There's a lot that's happened before. Just read it, Sammy said. Maybe I should start at the beginning, Melanie suggested. Just read what you're reading to yourself, Rather said gently. The voice had trembled before, but Melanie began. The wind roared high in the great tree which embowered the gates. She read. What's embowered? They asked her. Like a bower, Melanie said, like a thing hanging over you, like grapes or roses. It's a kind of bower where the shower is, Sanders said. Oh, someone said. The road as far as I could see, Melanie continued. To the right hand and left was all still and solitary. What's that? Sammy asked. Solitary is alone, Melanie said. Like solitaire, solitaire, Rather said, and there was an approving murmur. Shut up, you're interrupting, Sanders said. Well, we got to understand, Wednesday said. Just shut up, I said. Read, Rather said to Melanie, and she tried to go on. The road, all still and solitary, save for the shadows of clouds crossing it at intervals as the moon looked out, it was but a long, pale line, unvaried by one moving speck. Melanie read. On what? Someone asked. Unvaried means unchanged, not changed, Melanie said. I know that, Wednesday said. I got that one. Shut up, Sanders said. Puerile tear, Melanie began. She stopped. You don't know what puerile means, she said. It's not important that you know what every word means. Okay, someone said. Puerile tear dimmed my eye while I looked. Tear of disappointment and impatience. Ashamed of it, I wiped it away. There, we know what it is anyway, Monte said. I lingered. Melanie read. You what? Sammy asked. Hang around. To linger means to hang around, Melanie said sharply. She began again. The moon shut herself wholly within her chamber and drew close her curtain of dense cloud. It grew dark. It's getting scary now, Monte observed. Rain came driving fast on the wind. Melanie changed gale to wind without her knowing it. I wish he would come. I wish he would come, exclaimed, seized with hypochondriac foreboding. Melanie stopped with that. Tears filled her eyes and she couldn't see the words. There was a long silence before anyone spoke. What was she seized with? Sammy asked, frightened. I don't know, Melanie said, sobbing. Some kind of fear, I think. The respectful Marilynese sobs for a while, and then Sammy said, I guess it's some kind of horror story. Okay, we're getting close, thinking it's some like... I'm telling you, Irving was... I think he's just a bit too verbose as a writer. Like, there's just... They're like writers that don't have a way with words. And I think Irving was one of those writers. Like, it's like, is there a better way you could have put this? Probably. And this was before the time of AI, so maybe that's part something to do with it. I don't know. Anyway, page 321. You want to read that before you go to sleep? Mother asked Melanie with friendly concern, but Melanie lay down in her bed and turned off her reading light. When all the lights were out, Melanie felt Sanders sit on her bed beside her. If it had been Ma, she knew her bed would have snagged more heavily. You ask me, you better forget that boyfriend, Sanders said. If he didn't tell you how to find him, he ain't no good anyway. Melanie had not felt anyone stroke her temples since Mrs. Grogan in the girls' division at St. Cloud's. She realized she missed Mrs. Grogan very much, and for a while it took her mind off Homer Wells. When everyone was asleep, Melanie turned her reading light back on. Whatever failure Jane Eyre might be for someone else, it had always worked for Melanie. It had helped her, and she felt in need of its help now. She read another 20 pages or so. But Homer Wells would not leave her mind. I must part with you for my whole life, she read with horror. I must begin a new existence among strange faces and strange scenes. The truth of that closed the book for her forever. She slid the book under her bed in the bunk room in the Cider house at York Farm, where she would leave it. Had she just read the passage from David Copperfield that Homer Wells so loved and repeated to himself as if it were a hopeful prayer, she would have discarded David Copperfield too. I have stood aside to see the phantoms of those days go by me. Fat chance. Melanie would have thought. She knew that all the phantoms of those days were attached to her and Homer more securely than their shadows. So Melanie cried herself to sleep. She was not hopeful, yet she was determined, her mind's eye searching the darkness for Homer Wells. You could not have seen him that night. He was so well hidden beyond the range of the lights shining from the mill room at Ocean View. Even if he'd sneezed or fallen down, the sound of the grinder and the pump would have concealed his presence. He watched the red-eyed glow of the cigarettes that darted and paused above the roof of the cider house. When he got cold, he went to watch them pressing to have a little cider and rum. Mr. Rose seemed glad to see him. He gave Homer a drink with very little cider in it. Together, they watched the orchestra of the pump and grinder. A man named Jack, who had a terrible scar across his throat, a hard to survive kind of scar, aimed the spout. A man named Orange slapped the racks in place and received the splatter with a wild kind of pride. His name was Orange because he tried to dye his hair once. Orange was how it turned out. There was no evidence of that color on him now. Irma made Jack and Orange both savage about their busyness and defiantly unwary of the flying mess. Yet Homer felt that Mr. Rose, who seemed sober, was still in control, the conductor of both the men and the machinery, and operating them both at full throttle. Let's try to get out of here by midnight, Mrs. Rose said calmly. Mr. Rose. Jack choked the flow of pomace to the top rack. Orange levered the press into place. In the other corner of the mill room, two men whom Homer Wells didn't know were bottling at high speed. One of the men began to laugh, and his partner started to laugh with them so loudly that Mr. Rose called out to them, "What's so funny?" One of the men explained that his cigarette had fallen out of his mouth into the vat. At this announcement, even Jack and Orange began to laugh. Homer Wells smiled, but Mr. Rose said quietly, "Then you better fish it out. Nobody wants that milking up the cider." The men were quiet now, just as the machinery went on with its sluicing and screaming. "Go on," Mr. Rose repeated. "Go fish." The man with the lost cigarette stared into the 1,000-gallon vat. It was only half full, but it was still a swimming pool. He took off his rubber boots, but Mr. Rose said, "Not just the boots. Take off all your clothes, and then go to the shower and be quick about it. We got work to do." "What?" the man said. "I ain't gonna strip and go wash. Just to go swimming in there?" "You're filthy all over," said Mr. Rose. "Be quick about it." "Hey, you can be quick about it," the man said to Mr. Rose. "You want that butt out of there, you can fish it out yourself." It was Orange who spoke to the man. "What business you in?" Orange asked him. "Hey, what?" the man asked. "What business you in, man?" Orange asked. "Say, you in the apple business, man?" Jack advised the man. "Say what?" the man asked. "Just say you in the apple business, man," Orange said. It's at that moment that Mr. Rose took Homer's arm and said to him, "You got to see the view from the roof, my friend." The tug of his elbow was firm but gentle. Mr. Rose very gracefully led Homer out of the mill room, then outside by the kitchen door. "You know what business Mr. Rose is in, man?" Homer heard Orange asking. "He's in the knife business, man," he heard Jack say. "You don't want to go in the knife business with Mr. Rose," Homer heard Orange say. "You just stay in the apple business. You do fine, man," Jack said. Homer was following Mr. Rose up the ladder to the roof when he heard the shower turn on. It was an inside shower, more private than the shower at York Farm. Except for their cigarettes, the men on the roof were hard to see. Homer held Mr. Rose's hand and followed him along the plank on the rooftop until they found two good seats. "You all know Homer," Mr. Rose said to the men on the roof. There was a blur of greetings. The man called Hero was up there, and the man called Branches. There was someone named Willie, 2 or 3 people Homer didn't know, and the old cook whose name was Black Pan. The cook was the shape of a stew pot. It required some effort for him to gain his perch on the roof. Someone handed Homer a bottle of beer. The bottle was warm and full of rum. It stopped again, Branches said, and everyone started towards the sea. The night lights of Cape Kenneth were so low along the horizon, some of the lights themselves were not visible, only the reflections from them, especially when the lights were cast out over the ocean. The high Ferris wheel blazed brightly. It was holding still, loading new riders, sledding off the old. "Maybe it's stopped to breathe," Branches said, and everyone laughed at that. Someone suggested that it stopped to fart, and everyone laughed louder. Then Willie said, "When it gets too close to the ground, it has to stop, I think." Everyone appeared to consider this seriously. Then the Ferris wheel started again, and on the roof of the cider house released a reverential moan. "There it go again," Hero said. "Like a star," Black Pan, the old cook said. "You look real cool, but you get too close, it burn you. It's hotter than a flame." "It's a Ferris wheel," said Homer Wells. "It's a what?" Willie said. "A what wheel?" Branches asked. "A Ferris wheel," said Homer Wells. "That's the Cape Kenneth Carnival. That's the Ferris wheel." Mr. Rose nudged him in the ribs, but Homer didn't understand. No one spoke for a long time. When Homer looked at Mr. Rose softly shook his head. "Heard of something like that," Black Pan said. "I think they had one in Charleston." "Stopped again," Hero observed. "It's letting off passengers, riders," said Homer Wells. "It's taking on new riders." "People ride that fucking thing?" Branches asked. "Don't shit me, Homer," Hero said. Again, Homer felt the nudge on his ribs, and Mr. Rose said mildly, "You're also uneducated. Homer's having a little fun with you." When the bottle of rum passed from man to man, Mr. Rose just passed it along. "The name Homer mean nothing to you?" Mr. Rose asked the men. "I heard of it, like the cook Black Pan said. Homer was the world's first storyteller," Mr. Rose announced. The nudge at Homer's ribs was back. Mr. Rose said, "Our Homer knows a good story, too." "Shit," someone said after a while. "What kind of wheel you call it, Homer?" Branches asked. "A Ferris wheel," said Homer Wells. "Yeah," someone said. Everyone laughed. "Fucking Ferris wheel," Hero said. "That's pretty good." One of the men Homer didn't know rolled off the roof. Everyone waited until he was on the ground before they called down to him. You all right, asshole? Black Pan asked. Yeah, the man said, and everyone laughed. Mr. Rose heard the shower start up again. He knew that his bottle man had found the cigarette and was washing the cider off him. Willie and Hero, you're bottling now, said Mr. Rose. I bottled last time, Hero said. Then you're getting real good at it, said Mr. Rose. I'll press for a while, someone said. Jack and Orange are going good, Mr. Rose said. We'll just let them go for a while. Homer sensed that he should leave the roof with Mr. Rose. They helped each other with the ladder. On the ground, Mr. Rose spoke very seriously to Homer. You gotta understand, Mr. Rose whispered. They don't want to know what that thing is. What could it do them to know? Okay, said Homer Wells, who stood a long while out of the range of the lights blazing into the mill room. Now that he was more familiar with their dialect, he could occasionally understand the voices from the roof. It stopped again. He heard Branches say, It's taking on riders, someone said, and everyone laughed. Maybe it's an army place, Black Pan said. What army? Someone asked. We almost at war, Black Pan said. I heard that. Shit, someone said. Something for the airplanes to see, Black Pan said. Whose airplanes? Hero asked. There it go again, Branches said. Wells walked back through the orchards to the Worthington house. He was touched that Mr. Worthington had felt the light over the stairs on for him. When he saw the light under her bedroom door, he said quietly, Good night, Mrs. Worthington. I'm back. Good night, Homer, she said. He looked out Wally's window for a while. There was no way at that distance that he could witness the reaction on the cider house roof when the Ferris wheel in Cape Kenneth was shut off for the night. When all the lights went out with that blink, what did the men on the roof have to say about that? He wondered. Maybe they thought the Ferris wheel came from another planet. When all the lights went out, that it would return there. When Fuzzy Stone had loved to see it, thought Homer Wells, and clearly day and young Copperfield, and it would have been fun to ride it with Melanie just once to see what she would have said about it. Dr. Larch wouldn't be impressed. Was anything a mystery to Dr. Larch? In the morning, Mr. Rose chose to rest his magic hands between trees. He came up to Homer, who was working as a checker in the orchard called Frying Pan, counting the 1-bushel crates before they were loaded into the flatbed trailer and giving every picker credit for each bushel picked. I want you to show me that wheel, Mr. Rose said, smiling. Got like 4 or 5 more pages. Oh man, like, jeez. And I can see how this can make a good movie, but like it is not a pleasant reading experience at all. Okay. Anyway, you don't mind showing me, said Mr. Rose. There just can't be no talk about it. Or like maybe a good stage play. There's so many characters. Right, Homer said. We better go soon before it gets any colder and they close it out for the season. I'll bet it's pretty cold riding it now. I don't know if I want to ride it until I see it, said Mr. Rose. Sure, said Homer. Mrs. Worthington let him take the van, but when he picked up Mr. Rose at the cider house, everyone was curious. Gotta check something in the far orchard, Mr. Rose told the men. What far orchard are you talking about? Black Pan asked Hero when Homer and Mr. Rose got in the van. Homer Wells remembered his ride on the Ferris wheel with Wally. It's much colder now. Mr. Rose was subdued all the way to Cape Kenneth and uncharacteristically drawn to himself as they walked through the carnival together. Summer crowd was gone. Some of the carnival events were already closed up tight. Don't be nervous, Homer said to Mr. Rose. The Ferris wheel's perfectly safe. I'm not nervous about no wheels, said Mr. Rose. You see a lot of people my color around here? Homer had detected nothing hostile in the looks from the people. As an orphan, he always suspected the people singled them out to stare at. So he had not felt especially singled out in the company of Mr. Rose. But now he noticed more of the looks, realized that the looks of an orphan might detect were only imagined by comparison. When they got to the Ferris wheel, there was no line, but they had to wait for the ride in progress to be over. When the wheel stopped, Homer and Mr. Rose got out and sat together in one chair. We can each sit in our own chairs if you prefer, said Homer Wells. Keep it like it is, said Mr. Rose. When the wheel began its ascent, he sat very still and straight and held his breath until they were nearly at the top of the rise. Over there's the orchard, pointed Homer Wells, but Mr. Rose stared straight ahead, said the stability of the entire Ferris wheel relied on each rider's maintaining perfect balance. What's so special about doing this? Asked Mr. Rose rigidly. Just for the ride, and the view, I guess, said Homer Wells. I like the view from the roof, Mr. Rose said. When they started the descent on my wheel turn, Mr. Rose said, it's a good thing I didn't eat much today. By the time they passed ground level and began their ascent again, a substantial crowd had formed. They didn't appear to be standing in line for the next ride. There were only two couples and one boy himself, sharing the wheel with Homer and Mr. Rose. When they were at the top of the wheel turn again, Homer realized that the crowd below them had formed to stare at Mr. Rose. They come to see if niggers fly. I'm sorry if I should have said N-word or something. It's not my words, okay? It's John Irving. Chase after him. I'm not a racist. Mr. Rose might be, though. I don't know. Time to see if the machine's going to break down trying to carry an N-word. Or maybe they want to see me throw up. I don't know. Just don't do anything, Homer Wells asked. That's the advice I've been hearing all my life, boy, Mr. Rose said. As they started their descent, Mr. Rose leaned out of the chair, quite dangerously farther than was necessary. He vomited in a splendid arc over the crowd below them. The crowd moved as one. Not everyone moved in time. Their chair was at the bottom of the descent again. The Ferris wheel was stopped so that the sick man could get off. The crowd had retreated except for a young man who was especially splattered. Homer Wells and Mr. Rose were leaving the Ferris wheel grounds. The young man came forward and said to Mr. Rose, you look like you meant to do that. Who means to get sick? Said Mr. Rose, except he kept walking and Homer kept up with him. The young man was about Homer's age. He should have homework, thought Homer Wells. If he's still in school, it's a school night. I think you meant to, the young man said to Mr. Rose, who stopped walking away then. What business you in? Mr. Rose asked the boy. What? The young man asked, but Homer Wells stepped between them. My friend is sick, Homer Wells said. Please just leave him alone. Your friend? The boy said. Ask me what business I'm in, Mr. Rose said to the boy. What fucking business are you in, mister? The young man shouted at Mr. Rose. Homer felt himself neatly shoved out of the way. He saw that Mr. Rose was standing very suddenly chest to chest with the boy. There was no sour smell of vomit on Mr. Rose's breath, however. Somehow Mr. Rose had slipped one of those mints in his mouth. The alertness that had been missing when Mr. Rose felt ill was back in his eyes. The boy seemed surprised that he was standing so close to Mr. Rose, and so suddenly he was a little taller, quite a bit heavier than Mr. Rose. Yet he looked unsure of himself. I said, what fucking business are you in, mister? The boy repeated, and Mr. Rose smiled. I'm in the throwing up business, Mr. Rose said in a humble manner. Someone in the crowd laughed. Homer Wells felt a surge of vast relief. Mr. Rose smiled in such a way that allowed the boy to smile too. Sorry if any of it got on you, Mr. Rose said nicely. No problem, said the young man, turning to leave. After taking a few steps, the boy turned inquisitively in Mr. Rose's direction. But Mr. Rose had grasped Homer Wells by the arm and was already walking on. Homer saw shock on the boy's face. The young man's flannel jacket, which was still zipped shut, was flopping wide open. A single crisp slash had slid from the collar to the waist. Every button on the boy's shirt was gone. The boy gaped at himself, and then at Mr. Rose, who did not look back. The boy had allowed himself to be pulled into the comfort of the crowd. How'd you do that? Homer asked Mr. Rose when they reached the van. Your hands got to be fast, Mr. Rose said. Your knife got to be sharp. But you do it with your eyes. Your eyes keep your eyes off your hands. Wide open jacket of the boy made Homer remember clearly how a scalpel made no mistakes. Only a hand makes mistakes. His chest was cold and he was driving too fast. When Homer turned off Drinkwater Road and drove through the orchards to the Cider house, Mr. Rose said, You see? I was right, wasn't I? What good is it to apple pickers to know about that wheel? It does no good to know about it. That's Homer Wells. And what good would it do Melanie to know about it, or Curly Day, or Fuzzy, or any Bedouin? Am I right? Rose demanded. Right, said Homer Wells. All right. Yeah. Now I'm having more and more commentary. It's just the chapters are just inward laborious. Like it's just like you can see my arm, like just leaning on the table. And it's like I don't know. Maybe it would have been a better short story. I don't know. We're on chapter 8, Opportunity Knocks. I think going forward, I basically just have to do it the way I've been doing it in half chapters. And there are 4 chapters remaining. There are 4 chapters remaining. We're in chapter 8, Opportunity Knocks. Cider House Rules. Okay. And let me see if I can turn you guys so you're more centered. Okay. Made it. Made it through another chapter of John Irving's Cider House Rules book. All right. I'm back to work too, IRL. And so that's the reason for the change in schedule. Mondays and Wednesdays are my current Cider House days. Friday, Saturday, Sunday will be my near automata days. If you're watching on TikTok, please remember to support the show. Like, comment, follow, share, donate, Venmo Stormer Show. It's all appreciated. If you're watching on YouTube, like, comment, share, subscribe, donate, Venmo Stormer Show. Anything and everything you do helps the show. Spread the word. The word is what you've heard. One thing I do appreciate about Irving, he has a very expansive vocabulary. He might be lacking in the colorful character category. Like, I think he needs to explore relationships more and be less concerned about events, in my personal critique of his writing, because, again, it's like very easy to get bogged down by experience. Like, you can probably write an entire book about a trip to Disneyland. If you just go into every gory detail about all the people that were there and every ride you went on and every feeling that you had, and it's like, okay, I get it. I get it, dude. But anyway, hope you have a nice night. I'm your host, Storm Show. Stay good, Storm Champions. Sleep tight. Have a good night. As always, thanks for watching.